welcome again to our workshop, Communicating Effectively. Let's dive right on in. Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. So we're just diving in. We just prayed. Welcome. My name is Mariah. Great to have you. So we are talking about communicating effectively. Now, obviously, if we're talking about communicating effectively, there are sometimes whenever we try to communicate and it's not quite so effective. And especially whenever we're thinking about college and we're thinking about especially the context of written communication. There's lots of different written communication that we need to do for college. We have papers to write, we're in discussion boards, we're emailing professors, we're emailing coaches, we're talking to classmates. But even outside of college, there's lots of writing and lots of communicating that we do. And so we want to make sure that we are communicating effectively and we're not communicating ineffectively. So I remember, I can tell you a whole bunch of stories whenever I've communicated to people and they just didn't quite hear the right thing, or maybe if you had a typo or something. I remember there was one text that my mom sent, and she would usually tell us to drive safely, right? And this one time she was doing voice to text, and for whatever reason, the voice to text picked up drive around ugly. How that came through, I have no idea, but that communication sort of fell flat. It didn't exactly come through effectively. So we want to talk again about how we can communicate effectively as we go through our college experience. So again, my name is Mariah. I'm one of the tutors at LBC. I'm also a writing professor. So I teach both online and in-person classes. So I'm excited to dive in today. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. Maybe. There we go. So we're going to start off by defining our terms. Whenever you signed up for the workshop, you probably saw in the description that we're talking about tap and tone. And for some of us, that might not be super familiar language. So we're going to go ahead and jump right on in. So tap and tone. So first of all, we're going to start with the T of tap. T stands for topic. Now, we have all sorts of different scenarios that you might involve yourself in, and they all have different topics. So whether you're thinking about a text message where you're asking your spouse, hey, what's for dinner? The topic is dinner. Or maybe if you have a paper and your professor says, hey, you need to write an expository essay on causes of homelessness in Pennsylvania. Then your topic is causes of homelessness in Pennsylvania. It's the what of the communication. Pretty straightforward. Our A is audience. Now, in the college environment, who is our primary audience, realistically? We have one person that we're really writing to most of the time whenever we're in college. Yeah, it's our professors, right? So most of the time, whenever we are in college, we're at the back of our heads, we're thinking about our professors, but they're not the only people that we're writing to. Even beyond college, we write to, again, our spouses, maybe our other family members. Maybe we write on social media to our family and friends. In the college environment, again, you may write to a coach. You might write to your classmates, and even your professor may ask you to sort of imagine an audience that you're picturing as you're writing to someone. Now, as we start to break these things down and we think about topic and audience, how I write about a topic for one audience is going to be different from how I write about a topic to another audience. So, for example, I like to write and teach ladies' Bible studies in my spare time. I know, because I'm not doing enough things with my life. And so whenever I'm teaching those studies, whenever I'm writing those studies, my audience is the ladies of my church, and they're adults, and I'm writing to Christian adults. I might write about, say, the book of Genesis. Now, how I write about the book of Genesis to a group of adult women is very different from how I'm going to write about the book of Genesis to a group of 4-year-olds. Like, it's just not going to be the same. Some of the information is going to be the same, but I'm going to leave a whole bunch of stuff out. I'm not going to go into the Hebrew weirdness. I'm not going to get into all of the ethical dilemmas. We're going to stick to the broad storylines, etc. And so even right away, we're seeing how the topic and audience can determine how we present our message. The next letter, P, stands for purpose. And there are some different broad reasons that we write, to inform, to persuade, to get something, maybe to negotiate a grade or something like that. And so whenever we're thinking about why am I writing, what do I want at the end of this? Sometimes our purpose is simply, okay, well, my purpose as the writer is I just want to get this assignment done. And so that's a good starting step. But even as you're thinking about what your professor is asking for from the assignment, if it's a reflection, they may be looking for some wrestling to see, are you really wrestling with the material? Or did you just sort of check the list off of things to answer? Or let's see, I teach, like I said, those writing classes, and I try to emphasize to my students that whenever we're talking about things like the means of persuasion for their argumentative essay, I'm saying, hey, whenever you're writing, I'm not just looking to see you talk about things that Platt does in counterculture. I want you to actually make sure that you're using the terminology that we discussed in class and making those connections very explicit. Why? Because part of why I want you to write this is because you're demonstrating to me as the professor that you understand these concepts and that you're putting these pieces together. So that's part of their purpose, is to demonstrate their understanding, to demonstrate their knowledge. And so we always want to have our purpose in mind whenever we're writing as well, because that's also going to shape how we present our message. Now, the final word is a word, not an abbreviation, and it's tone. And tone can be a hard thing to define, but it's just the way something sounds. And again, this gets a little bit tricky because whenever you write something, there isn't a sound, right? It's just whatever's there on the piece of paper. But you read something, and most of us have like a voice inside of our heads. And if you read something out loud, then you would sort of mimic the way that you think that the author wrote it. And how many of you guys have ever gotten a text message where somebody just used all caps? Like my grandmother loves to send messages in all caps. And then I'm like, Nanny, are you mad at me? And she's like, no, I'm just excited. But because she wrote everything in all caps, like it communicated that message. I'm like, oh my goodness, are you upset? And no, she just hasn't quite gotten to that piece of using her cell phone, which is fine. But so we can understand that something written in all caps communicates something. And so the way that we write, there's a whole bunch of things that goes into how it sounds. We can make something sound more informal or more formal, again, depending on the rest of our situation. So what we're going to do in the rest of our workshop is we're going to take a closer look at tap and tone in some specific scenarios. I'm going to ask for some audience participation, and we'll get some ideas thrown in. And then we'll keep rolling, and we'll see if we can apply some of these to the specific writing contexts for college. Now, I did just use this term, writing context, and that's just a fancier way of saying, hey, I need to communicate in a written form situation. So some sort of situation in which you need to communicate, and you need to do so, again, in a written context. So one example of a context in which I need to communicate in written form. So I need to send my church's ladies leadership team an update on the potential speaker for the ladies retreat. So this actually happens quite frequently with our group where we'll get these little assignments and then we'll have our little signal chat and they'll be asking for updates on different things. And so I may need to say, hey, I need to communicate with the rest of my team. What's my update on this situation? And so as we return to the concepts that we talked about earlier, we're just going to stick with the first three for now. But before we do that, we're going to start into our audience participation part of the program. And so what I'm going to ask from everybody who's in the call, and looks like right now the other person dropped out, so it's just you, my friend, is that we're going to come up with as many situations that we need to communicate in written form in the stage of life that you're in. So we can think about being a college student, being a spouse, parent, worker, a volunteer, etc. So again, so one of my examples is being on the leadership team is that we need to communicate updates all the time on the different little tasks that we've been assigned to. Another situation that I actually found myself in just today is my boss gave me an assignment and I needed additional clarification on how to complete the assignment. And so I wrote her an email and requested some clarification on how to complete the assignment that she had given to me. Anybody want to contribute any additional situations that we need to write in? And I'll take some notes as we're going. You can either send them in the chat or unmute and send them in. Give everybody a second or so to think about it. Let's see. Okay, yeah, discussion boards. Definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Like in our classes, we have a lot of writing.
Absolutely. What kinds of writing?
Well, aside from the discussion boards, we're working on a faith and learning paper, connecting faith and learning right now.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Paper. And so that's the specific form of that is an essay. So spectacular. Good, good, good. Thank you so much. Ooh, professor email. Yep. Email to your professor. How many of you guys have needed to do that? Yep. Sir, email. Excellent. Okay, so that's a great start. So keep on thinking about different situations in which we need to communicate. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to start comparing and contrasting different written contexts from one to another. So we can start to see how we leverage tap and tone to communicate our messages. So we're going to come back to my initial example of needing to send an update to my ladies leadership team. And we're going to think about, again, tap and tone. So I have my topic. What is the topic that I'm speaking about in this message? Well, I'm providing the update on the potential speaker. So I did some research on this speaker and I need to communicate with my team what my recommendation is. So that's the topic. The audience is the other my audience members are the other members of my team. So there are 4 other members, and so I know exactly who they are, and I know that our sort of our overarching mindset is we want to build up the ladies of our congregation. We want to find speakers who are engaging, who can speak about scripture knowledgeably, and who aren't heretics. So, you know, we've got all that in the background. No heretics is always a good place to start, right? And then what's my purpose? Now, obviously, I'm sending an update to my ladies leadership team. That's a purpose. However, I'm also thinking about what do I really think about this potential speaker? And how invested am I in the speaker either speaking or not speaking? Now, I'm talking about a real situation, so I will be honest and say, so recently I did need to do some research on a potential speaker, and I was not impressed, but I wasn't like, oh, this is a heretic. I was like, nah, That's sort of like a middling, right? I was like, she would be fine, but like I wouldn't necessarily spend $1,000 to bring her from whatever state she was in to speak in Pennsylvania. And so whenever I communicated this information to my ladies leadership team, my purpose was to inform, to give my not necessarily like a glowing recommendation, but like a, hey, if everybody else liked the speaker, that I would be okay with her coming in, because I didn't think that she would be harmful. I thought that she would be a fine speaker, but I didn't necessarily want to persuade everybody to like come and be on my like team, whoever the speaker was, because I wasn't necessarily super enthralled with her, but I was okay with her. And so whenever I formulated this message, I had to take all three of these things into consideration whenever I sculpted that message and sent it out to my team. Now, as we think about some of our additional writing context here, again, so we have our topic, our audience, and our purpose. So with, say, a professor email, whenever we're emailing our professor, obviously the audience is going to be our professor, so that's going to be an easy one. Who are we addressing? It's going to be the professor directly. Most often our topic is either going to be a clarification on an assignment or a question about a grade. And so in both of those contexts, our purpose is usually to get some additional information from the professor. So we're asking for something from them. Or perhaps we're trying to negotiate because maybe we don't think that we got the grade that we should have. So we're asking for something. We're negotiating for a higher grade. And so in both of these situations, we want to be considering what we talked about. The last thing that I said, hey, we're not going to really focus on it yet, but now it's going to start to come back into play, is the tone. So whenever we're writing to our professor and we're trying to get something from them, do you guys think that we should be more informal and casual or more formal and professional? The discussion board here. Yeah. Yeah, more formal, polite. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Uh-huh. Yes, definitely. Definitely professional. Absolutely, absolutely. We don't want to be, yo, what's up? Why did you give me that grade? Because, well, your professor probably isn't going to react well to that. We want them to listen to us. And, you know, if we think that they didn't handle the assignment correctly, or like you really thought that we checked all the boxes, then we want our professor to be on our team. And so we want to approach them respectfully and with grace. Excellent, excellent. What about, let's say, we didn't talk about this one, but you probably will have this happen while you're in college, a text message to a family member, and you're just talking about maybe plans for the weekend. Is that sort of thing something where you need to be more formal, or can you be a little bit more informal? Mm-hmm. Yeah, more informal. You don't need to have like, you know, the stiff upper lip because, well, it's a comfortable environment. You don't need to worry about having everything be especially formal. And so you can be a little bit more casual. Now, a discussion board forum. Now, this is an interesting one because now the topic is going to vary depending on, of course, the class. But most of the time, discussion board forums are asking you to sort of explore your thoughts a little bit. With discussion board forums, who is the audience? Is it just your professor? Yep, got that message. No, it's the rest of the class too, right? So you're talking both to your professor and to your classmates, which creates a little bit of an interesting dynamic because usually we try to be a little bit more professional with our professor, but with our classmates, we can be a little bit more relaxed. And so as we think about the purpose, what is our purpose for this assignment? It's usually some combination of showing engagement with whatever material our professors have presented us with, And our professors are interested in seeing that we're engaging with the community. And so we want to, of course, always be respectful, but we can ask questions, we can really engage with the other people's material, so that, again, we can fulfill the purpose of that communication, which isn't just to demonstrate our own understanding, but also to engage with the community and with the community learning. Now, something like the faith and learning paper, which is like an essay, it's a formal essay. This is an interesting assignment because it sort of blends the lines a little bit between formality and informality, because it's a personal reflection, but it's still in essay form. So we're gonna really dive in a little bit more to this in just a moment as we slide forward here. We're going to talk about how we can make our submissions either more formal or less formal. So we're going to start off with informal tone. Now, I think that we can often tell when something is informal, is like the example that I used earlier when my dear grandmother sends me a text message that is in all caps. There's no punctuation. Everything is abbreviated. There's random emojis in there. We can tell that that's something that's a little bit more informal. And then whenever we're looking at like a piece of legislation or the Constitution, we can instinctively tell that that's more formal. But we want to be able to have some good guardrails, some things to guide us, so that whenever we're crafting our own messages, we can be strategic in making sure that our tone is appropriate for the topic, audience, and purpose that we're writing for, so that we can make sure that our purpose is accomplished. So let's go through this list here and see maybe some things that we want to avoid for more formal settings, but we maybe want to use for more informal settings. So slang is something that is definitely not super appropriate for a formal writing scenario. However, between friends, like if there's some common vernacular that you guys use between, like in a certain area, that can be more appropriate. Abbreviations or contractions. So I talked to my students just the other day about the word statistics. Now, while it's a hard word to say fast, try saying it 3 times fast and you'll slip up around word 2. A lot of people abbreviate the word statistics to stats, and that's more informal. The word etc. is usually abbreviated to etc. And etc. So whenever we abbreviate something, we're automatically making it more informal. Same thing with contractions. So won't instead of will not, shouldn't instead of should not, don't instead of do not. You get the picture. Whenever we shorten the word, it makes it more informal. Now, whenever I write both skits for our church and whenever I'm writing for our ladies' Bible studies, when, again, I know these ladies pretty well, and I like to sort of have a conversation with them as I'm writing. It's nice for me to have some contractions and some abbreviations because it makes it less formal and more of a conversation. It also feels more natural. So whenever you're texting your best friend or you're texting a relative, you're not going to say, I would love to go to, like, you're going to abbreviate some things because it's going to be more natural. And so those are times whenever we want things to be a little bit more informal. Now, first or second person voice. These are 2 different things. Now, voice is just sort of the perspective from which you're speaking. So first person voice is using I, me, and my. Or first person plural, which is we, our, and us. Now, whenever we're using first person voice, obviously you're sort of taking the audience, you're putting your hand around them and you're drawing them into the picture. So you're naturally drawing them in, makes it more informal because you're inviting them to join the perspective. If you're saying I, that's very, very personal. That's very informal. And so it's definitely an informal thing. Now, second person voice is you and your. And as I tell my students, it's like you take your finger and you point it at the face and lean in close and look them straight in the eyes and say, you. And of course, my students usually jump a little bit whenever I do it because it's a little bit uncomfortable. And so whenever we're writing, if we're using second person voice, even if we don't say you directly and you say something like, vote to restrict abortion rights or whatever the case may be, and that's an implied you because you're giving a direct command to your audience, that's very direct and that's very informal. So anytime we're using first or second person voice, these are both informal ways of writing. Now, there are going to be some times whenever using first or second person voice is actually going to be appropriate. So, like we were talking about with that faith and learning paper, your professor wants you to reflect on your own personal faith journey. So it wouldn't make sense in that case to just get rid of I, me, and my, because all of a sudden you're talking about somebody else's journey instead of your own journey. And so we want to keep the first person voice for that. Same thing for discussion board forums. Our discussion board forums are intended to be very interactive. And so it makes sense in that case for us to use first person voice and to use second person voice because we're actually addressing the other members of our class directly. And so in that case, it's appropriate. But as we'll see later on, whenever we're doing more formal essays, first and second person voice isn't quite as appropriate. Vague wording. Now, even whenever I was creating the slide for the next bullet point, I was fighting using vague wording. So words like good, bad, okay, these are words that you could fill in with 1,000, maybe not 1,000, but a whole bunch of other words that would be more specific. And whenever we're using vague words, it's just informal because it's not giving the readers a specific direction to direct their thoughts in. And so it can go anywhere. And so it tends to be more informal. Usually, for most of the writing that you're doing for the college, whether it's a discussion board forum, professor email, essay, we want to be as specific as possible. But again, there's plenty of situations that will exist in where it doesn't matter as much if we're using vague wording. My texts to my mother are miss words all the time because I'm like, Mom, she's gonna fill in the blanks. She can read my mind. It'll be fine. I'll use some vague wording with my mother, but for the most part, we want to be specific with our language. Two additional ones in the informal tone. This one is where I was tempted to use vague wording, and I was like, bad grammar. And I'm like, no, be more specific. In any case, if we don't have things punctuated correctly, if we're using the incorrect verb tenses, if we're spelling things incorrectly, again, if we're thinking about text messages or maybe even social media posts, where it doesn't really matter as much. And in fact, sometimes brevity is the thing that's more important. And so things will be intentionally shortened in order to communicate more ideas faster. That can be appropriate because it's a more informal setting. And it's fine to, it's not that these things are inherently wrong. It's just that it's not appropriate for necessarily a more formal setting. But in some cases, it can be okay. Finally, no or little formatting. Again, thinking about those text messages, my dear grandmother, with all of her words essentially running together, no punctuation, and there's not like a hello, my dear granddaughter, and then like another line entered down, and it's just straight, everything straight through. I think again, for most of the situations that we're considering in the college setting, you do want to have some formatting in there, but in a lot of the other extra skill contexts that we're writing in, avoiding formatting can, if you have an email to your friends set up like a formal business email, they're going to get weirded out and be like, why are you setting up your letter? Like, what is this? Am I under arrest? Like, what's going on? So again, we just want to be aware that there are plenty of times whenever an informal tone is appropriate. However, as we've been alluding to, most of the writing that we're going to do for the college space is going to be in a more formal style. We're going to be using a more formal tone. So again, let's go through, and most of these are just going to be the polar opposite of what we just walked through. So instead of using vague words or slang, instead we want to use proper and field-specific terminology. So especially as you get into the not necessarily higher level classes, but into the classes that are aligned with your field of expertise that you're heading into. So if it's counseling, those counseling classes, if it's Bible, those Bible classes, and the theology classes, you're going to start to learn some terminology. And so it's appropriate to use the specific terminology that you're picking up in class instead of just using broad terms. So for example, in my writing class, LEN 101, we were talking about using different appeals. We're using emotional appeals and appeals to reason and appeals to authority. And so there are some Greek and Latin words that are affiliated with that. And so I tell my students, hey, it's absolutely appropriate for you to use words like ethos or logos instead of just saying, well, he used statistics, because they're picking up the vocabulary that's appropriate for what we're analyzing. Having them use phrases like the major premise whenever they're setting up a deductive argument, instead of just saying the principle that's at work. Why? Because it's more field specific. And again, it's demonstrating their knowledge, and it's showing yourself as the student as sort of entering into the field along with the professor. And because that's ultimately part of what we're doing at the end of the day, is helping all of the students to come alongside and enter into the profession that we're already operating in. Again, in contrast to abbreviating and having contractions, a formal tone will avoid those abbreviations and contractions. So I tell my students, hey, you can actually do a search in your document, like search for the little apostrophe and then the letter T. And then you can catch those and eliminate them before you submit your paper. Just expand it out. I don't know why. It sounds more formal whenever we don't have abbreviations and contractions, but it definitely does. You can absolutely tell whenever something is more formal or less formal just by switching out having contractions versus eliminating those contractions. Next, and this admittedly is difficult, consistently using third-person voice. This is, like I said, difficult, first of all, for me, because I am very accustomed to writing in contexts where I am in an active conversation and I'm picturing my audience and I'm thinking about them. Sometimes I even imagine them saying something back to me, and then like I'll write as if they asked the question and say, that's a great question, let me go ahead, and like I'll actually write the entire conversation down because I want to engage in that conversation. However, that's informal. That's very much taking the person and bringing them face to face with me. And for most writing contexts, you're not going to be doing that. Instead, you're going to be more formal, more professional. And so whenever we're talking about, again, thinking about those persuasive essays, and instead of saying something like, we should vote to restrict abortion access, I challenge my students to consider, well, who is the we that you're talking about? And they'll usually think about it and say something like, okay, well, Christians in America is who I'm talking to. And I say, okay, well, then instead of saying we, substitute in Christians in America, because that's who you're talking about. So go ahead and just substitute that proper noun in for who you're thinking of. And of course, it's not always going to be that a proper noun. Sometimes it'll be just something like doctors or students in America, or perhaps it'll be something like the third person pronouns, like they, them, or their. That's perfectly appropriate as well. This is going to be especially appropriate for those most formal of settings whenever your professor is really emphasizing that we want to practice that formal tone. Next, stellar, excellent, spectacular grammar, punctuation, and spelling. The more we practice using good punctuation, grammar, and spelling, the easier it'll come. I tell my students whenever we're looking at different websites and we're trying to decide whether or not it's a credible website, one of the things that we can use to help us figure out if the website is credible or not is we look at if it's punctuated and spelled and grammared, that's not a word, it's okay, correctly. And if there are a whole bunch of spelling mistakes, if there are a whole bunch of punctuation errors, it looks sloppy. And if the creators have been that sloppy with just their punctuation and spelling, well, how am I to trust the actual content that they've input on their website? And so the same thing goes for us. If we take care with our grammar, spelling, and punctuation, then it communicates that we've taken care with the rest of what we've written. And so taking our time in the learning and putting into practice these elements will help us to communicate a more formal tone. Last, but certainly not least, is correct formatting. Now, the formatting is going to vary depending on what we're doing. If we're doing a discussion board post, most of the time your professors aren't asking for full MLA formatting for that, but perhaps they are asking for in-text citations. Maybe they're asking for you to respond to a couple of different prompts. If you're sending an email, a correct formatting might be something like whoever you're talking to on one line with a comma or a colon at the end, hitting enter a couple of times, writing a paragraph or two of your request, hitting enter again, and then saying, thank you very much, enter, and then your name. It's funny how even something like hitting enter a couple of times can communicate that this is more formal rather than just having everything on one full line. I had a student the other day email me and the entire message was in the subject line. And I just had to laugh because it is more informal than if they had put it in the actual body of the email. Of course, whenever we are in classes that are requiring essay submissions, usually professors are asking for either MLA or APA formatting. And again, there's just something about having a paper set up with that additional formatting that makes it feel more formal. It's like whenever you receive a letter from a lawyer or from the IRS and it has that special heading at the top and the header and like the font's all interesting and they have the full address and then the enter and you're like, oh man, this is serious. And so we can, again, there's something about formatting that communicates formality. And so whenever we're in those more formal writing scenarios, we want to make sure that we're using the correct formatting, whatever the correct formatting is for that scenario. Okay, so going back to once more, my example of the I need to communicate situation. So my written context of needing to send my church's ladies leadership team an update on the potential speaker for the ladies retreat. I have to decide how formal I want to be. Now, if I went full formal and I went like a written proposal, that would be too formal for this particular situation. That's just not how our team communicates. And so what I ended up doing in this situation was I wrote probably a couple of paragraphs, like a paragraph and a half, and sent it into our chat. And I was pretty informal because I didn't really feel the need, like I said earlier, to necessarily persuade them one way or the other. I had some thoughts. I didn't think that it would be any harm to invite this particular speaker, but I wasn't especially raving about the speaker either. So I was like, you know what? I don't need to impress the leadership team at this point with a really formal summation of what I think about this speaker. I can be a little bit more informal. And so now as we transition to writing context at LBC, the moment we have all been waiting for. So let's go item by item, and we're going to think about potential topics, audiences, purposes, and then as a result, what kind of tone and along with that, how might we communicate that tone with each of these elements? So we'll start at the top here with a reflection paper. And whenever I say reflection paper, I'm not necessarily thinking about the faith and learning paper, because that's a little bit of a different situation. But oftentimes your professor will create an assignment and it'll say something like, what questions do you still have about this material? What was an idea that really stood out to you? How will you apply the concepts that you've learned? And so the topic is something like, what stood out to you from the reading? What questions do you still have? The audience in this case is really very directly your professor. There's not really anybody else that you're writing for. Your professor's not asking you to create an image of an audience in your mind. It's just the professor. And so your purpose for this assignment really is to demonstrate that engagement with the material, to show that you have been learning this week, and to show even perhaps attention to the detail, and not skip any of the prompts. So, say, okay, I have a paragraph answering the question, do I still have any questions? I have a paragraph answering one big idea that stood out, and I have a paragraph talking about the application. And so as we think about tone, this is an interesting one. So what do you think? Can we use first or second person voice? So can I use I in this paper? Anybody have any thoughts? Oops. We went too far.
Yes. I would say yes. I use
Absolutely.
I in my reflections.
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, I would tell my students, please use first person voice in your reflection paper, because otherwise I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, this is so weird. This is bizarre. However, so for most of the rest of the elements, so like contractions, abbreviations, slang, I'm going to want to avoid most of the rest of those informal categories, because this is still a formal assignment that I'm submitting. So I'm going to want to use correct formatting with the MLA. I'm going to want to avoid those contractions and use those full words. And probably I'm going to want to try to use some of that terminology that we've picked up in the class itself. Now, discussion board posts, again, it's going to vary very widely depending on whatever class you're talking about. Usually what they're asking for you to do is to interact with some sort of material, whether it's a video or an article, and then to respond to that material and maybe to summarize some major elements or whatever the case may be. Present your thoughts. They're usually a little bit more open-ended, but not always. Your audience in this case is still your professor, but also the rest of your class, but also your professor. Your professor is always going to be your audience in the back of your mind, because we're always thinking about demonstrating our understanding. And so our purpose, as I just mentioned, part of it is going to be demonstrating our understanding. But as we talked about earlier, another part of our purpose is going to be showing that engagement with our classmates. And so the tone for this one can actually be a little bit more informal. Now, unless, of course, your professor specifically says, hey, make sure that you keep a formal tone in your discussion board posts. Usually it's easier for people to engage with one another if it's just a little bit more informal. And so you still want to practice using that correct terminology, but allowing some contractions, using, hey, I think that's a really good point. Whenever you said that's appropriate, because that again helps to build that community element. So with our tone with that one, we can sort of blend the formal and the informal together even more. Now, an email to our professor, as we alluded to earlier, again, usually it's going to be in the context of asking for something. And so because we're requesting something from our professor, we're going to want to keep that formal tone. Now, this is where probably actually as I discuss things with professors, because I know a lot of the professors, a lot of the writing professors, a lot of the Bible professors, theology professors, one of the things that I hear the most is that they're just surprised by how casual students are in the emails. And again, not that it's wrong to be informal with somebody who feels like a friend, but we want to consider the context that we're writing in and the purpose for which we're writing. And so it's strategic to, whenever we're writing an email to our professor, to say something like, greetings, professor, or hello, so-and-so, and then to actually hit enter, to go ahead and have the formatting in the email to end with a thank you, and to use that more formal tone because we're asking them a question. Now, a persuasive research essay, no matter what our topic is, whether it's talking about abortion or gun control or the immigration crisis or whatever the case is, usually our professor is going to ask us to imagine some kind of audience. And if it's a persuasive research essay, they're going to ask us to imagine an audience that disagrees with us, which makes situation very, very exciting because you get to think about this imaginary audience and say, how would I persuade them to come closer to my own point of view? Now, even though we're writing to this imaginary audience, who's still our audience in the background? That's right, our professor. And so with that in mind, remember, not only is our purpose whatever they said our purpose was for this essay, to persuade the audience to come closer to our position, whatever the case may be, but it's also, once again, to demonstrate to our professors that we've been learning whatever they've been teaching us. And so as you consider things like creating strong topic sentences, so some of us are moving into LIN 100, so you'll be learning about things like creating strong paragraph structure, incorporating evidence, having a thesis statement at the end of your introduction that lays out the major points of your essay. Those are things that you want to keep in mind, that it's not just, am I writing persuasively, but am I showing my professor that I learned the things that we talked about while we were in class? Am I showing them as well that I'm taking the steps that is necessary for me to becoming a part of this community that I'm striving to become a part of by taking these classes and by earning my degree? And so our tone for a persuasive research essay is definitely going to be formal. We're going to avoid all contractions. We're going to avoid both first and second person voice. We're going to stick all together with third person voice. We're going to make sure that our punctuation and everything is just golden grams. Now, finally, note to self. What do you think? Does that need to be super formal? I certainly hope not. I certainly hope not, because if we're writing a note to ourselves, go ahead, chime on in.
No, I was just going to say, no, I would not be formal with myself. That'd be very awkward.
I know, right? I'd be like, what am I doing? Like, did I hit my head? What's going on? And so, of course, whenever the purpose for writing something to ourselves is usually to remind ourselves of something that we're afraid that we're going to forget. I write a lot of notes to myself, actually, whenever I'm writing a lesson and I feel like something's not phrased right, or I feel like the organization's off, and I'm just focused on generating content. So I'll add a comment and say, hey, make sure you come back to this, or this just stinks. I use the vaguest vocabulary, but it's okay, because whenever I come back, I'm going to know, because it's a note to myself, I know the context of what I'm talking about. Of course, I need to be specific enough that I can understand what I mean whenever I come back later. But it can definitely be more informal. Now, again, these are all writing contexts that we're going to encounter at LBC. And so it's important for us to take time to consider each writing context individually and to think about really what is the topic that my professor is asking me to write about or that I've just been introduced to. Who is my audience, and is there a primary audience and perhaps an audience that's in the shadows, or am I really just writing to one singular audience? And then what is the purpose, or what are the purposes for which I'm writing? Am I writing just to demonstrate my understanding, or are there other purposes that are at work? And so with each of those purposes, I do want to consider what tone am I aiming for? Am I aiming for an informal tone or a formal tone? And how am I going to leverage all of those pieces and parts together in order to create the kind of tone that will successfully communicate my message to my audience? And so as we wrap up here, I want to remind everybody that you can always visit the LibGuides in the Ally Center and click on the Ally Center link, and that will take you to all of our upcoming workshops. We do have a whole bunch of workshops coming up for October, so if you haven't signed up for those yet, you should jump on in because we've got some excellent ones on the way. Of course, we are available outside of workshops to be able to assist with any stage of either the writing process or just if you need some other assistance, maybe with time management, with study skills, whatever the case, we are here to be helpful. Thanks everybody for joining us today for Communicating Effectively.